Hi everyone, welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie, and for those of you who are new to this channel, this is a channel where I read through all of the unread books on my bookshelf until we reach zero, and we are a long way from zero, but slowly getting there. I can't believe it's December already, and it being a new month, it's time to do my wrap up of what I read in November. And November was a fabulous month. I decided to partake in nonfiction November, and I had a couple of books on my TBR, which is in my previous video, based on the prompts and based on what books I had on my bookshelf that are unread. And I managed to get through 3 books in November based on the prompts. I thought that was pretty good for me. I'm not typically a fast reader. In terms of sheer speed, I actually read fairly quickly. However, I don't have a lot of time to read because I work as a lawyer. So based on kind of my little bit of time that I have to read every day, I normally over the course of a month get through somewhere between 2 to 4 books. So 3 is a fairly standard month for me. And I want to start with the first book, which is based on the prompt word of capital. Now, a lot of people think about capital in the sense of capitalism or capital cities, but I suppose maybe it's the lawyer in me. When someone mentions capital, I think of capital punishment. And there was certainly a lot of capital punishment in this book, The Tyrannicide Brief by Geoffrey Robertson. So for those who don't know, Geoffrey Robertson is a human rights lawyer. I think he's Australian originally, but he practices law in the UK. And he tells the legal history of John Cook, the man who prosecuted a king. And not just any king, but King Charles I. So John Cook was a relatively minor junior barrister at the time when he was asked or briefed to present the case on behalf of Parliament to prosecute King Charles I. And this is against the backdrop of the English Civil Wars and the conflict at the time between the forces who were loyal to King Charles I and the forces who were loyal to Parliament. And all of this coming, of course, in the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth I dying, and then kind of the Stuarts coming into power. And this book goes through kind of a little bit of that history and a lot of the history of the English Civil Wars, followed by the Interregnum and followed then by the Stuart Restoration. And against that backdrop, we have the trial of King Charles I, which was the main episode in the first part of the book. And it really goes through in incredible detail the transcripts from the trial, what happened at trial, and some of the legal principles that were applicable at the time, which might seem foreign now to a modern day lawyer. For example, in the trial of King Charles I, back in the day, there was no presumption of innocence. So whereas in the modern day legal system, if you were charged with a crime and you decided that you were not going to specifically plead, you're presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. So the prosecution has to go and prove that you committed the crime. Whereas back in the day, the onus was in reverse. So that means that if you refuse to plead to a particular crime, you are presumed to be guilty and the prosecution doesn't have to do anything. Now that seems extraordinary to a modern day lawyer, but that was what was applicable at the time. And that was an argument that was probably unwisely relied on by Charles because he refused to plead. His sole argument is that I am king, I am above the law, you do not have the right. What right or power do you have to prosecute me? And it's really interesting because that argument is still used by a lot of dictators when faced with international criminal sanctions now, whether it's Milosevic or Pinochet or Saddam Hussein. A lot of them look at the international community who are trying to hold them to account for their actions, and they say, what right do you have? I am the leader of a sovereign nation. What right does the international community have to hold me to account? And actually the logic of that, despite the passage of many centuries, has not changed. I really enjoyed the book. I like the evolution of the legal argument throughout. This was in an era where kings were thought to have divine right and were answerable only to God. And so in that sense, I understood the difficulty. I think Geoffrey Robertson did a good job in helping his readers appreciate the difficulties of running, of trying to prosecute a king who says, I am only answerable to God, I'm not answerable to Parliament, and I'm certainly not answerable to you. And it's extraordinary to think about how advanced that thinking was. Even in the 20th century and the 21st century, crimes against humanity are still being tested before international criminal courts. If you only see the trial of Milosevic, for the atrocities committed under his command. These are concepts that mankind are still grappling with. My main criticism of the book, however, is that it's a little bit dry. So other than kind of the legal argument, which I can appreciate from a professional perspective, the events in question here are some of the most fascinating and gory events in the history of England. And the writing really just didn't do it justice. It was quite analytical and it was a little bit on the dry side. That's a useful contrast to the next book, because the next book seems to be about nothing, but was written so beautifully that you just end up loving it. And it's a real lesson in the importance of kind of the aesthetics of the language as well. So the next book I want to talk about is Joan Didion's. I have here the compiled volume of several of her works, but I read out of this compiled volume the second essay collection that she published in 1979, which is The White Album. Now, as I said before, this is kind of about nothing. So The White Album is a collection of essays, some of which were sort of published in magazines like Esquire or Vanity Fair, and they all center on capturing America in the 1960s, and in particular with an emphasis on California. And it's a mix of different styles. There's a fair bit of biography in there about what was happening at the time in Joan Didion's own life. There's a fair amount of cultural observations, interviews with members of the Black Panther, essay reflections on society and politics and life itself. And each essay feels like a disparate topic in itself, but together they paint a picture of the zeitgeist of the 1960s and that sense of society grappling with itself on the precipice of change, but trying to become a better version of itself while dealing with a fair amount of self-loathing. That's the overwhelming feel, this kind of nervousness that comes out of these essays about who America is as a country and what was happening in society at the time. The title essay, The White Album, which I thought was particularly poignant, it's sort of these very small snapshots of American society in the 1960s, from the late 1960s till basically the early 1970s. And there is no through narrative or central theme until you get to the end, where Joan Didion reveals a little bit of her own personal narrative in all of this that kind of ties all the different snapshots together, and not unlike an album. I want to read a little bit from The White Album. I don't usually read out loud because I'm terrible at it, but let's see how we go. So this is from the start of the essay, The White Album, but it's also the start of the book. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. The princess is caged in the consulate. The man with the candy will lead the children into the sea. The naked woman on a ledge outside the window on the 16th floor is a victim of accident, or the naked woman is an exhibitionist, and it would be interesting to know which. We tell ourselves that it makes some difference whether the naked woman is about to commit a mortal sin, or is about to register a political protest, or is about to be, in the Aristophanic view, snatched back to the human condition by the fireman in priest's clothing just visible in the window behind her, the one smiling at the telephoto lens. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5, We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we're writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by ideas with which we have learnt to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience. So this is the start of that essay, but I really kind of enjoyed the part about this idea of we're trying to find a narrative through line through disparate images. And indeed, for the rest of the essay, that's exactly what she does. She gives you these snapshots of disparate images back in the late 1960s, early 1970s in California. And then there is this search for meaning, in this search for a narrative through line that will tie all these images together. And even though she doesn't quite get there in the end, you understand that's what she's trying to do. I really enjoyed this. I like Joan Didion, so my assessment of her essays are somewhat rose-colored, but she's also, I have to say, she's not a writer to be binged. She's very much a kind of a slow saver. But I really enjoyed it. I'm very, very happy. I still have the rest of this collection to read. So I've read Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which is, I think, my favorite out of the two that I read. And I've read The White Album. And then after this, there is also Salvador, Miami, After Henry, Political Fictions, and Where I Was From. So I still have quite a few volumes in this collected volume to read. But this is published by Everyman's Library. And I really highly recommend this as a volume, because if you like Joan Didion, you'll want the whole thing. And I should say that for The White Album, the word that inspired it out of Nonfiction November was display, because in my mind, albums are used to display. Somewhat tenuous link, but we're going with it. So on to the last book I read in November, which was inspired by the word web, and that's Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow by Yuval Harari. Now, this is a standalone book, but as I was reading it, I did feel that I would have benefited from reading Yuval Harari's book immediately prior to this one, which was Sapiens, which looks at kind of macro level human history and the development through each of the stages and why humankind is different to all other animals. He does touch a little bit on that in this book. So Homo Deus is a look at mankind's future based on what happened in our past. And rather than resorting to these kind of truisms about how history always repeats itself, etc., Harari actually argues that we are entering a new stage of human evolution. Whereas in the past, mankind has always been challenged by famine or plague and war, these challenges have now been conquered. And now mankind must find for itself new goals. And in Harari's mind, that's happiness, that is immortality, which is an interesting one, and immortality to be achieved through biological manipulation, if possible. And along our path to immortality, he also looks at where we've landed spiritually. So he looks at the human history from the beginning of deist religions, so Islam or Christianity, to what we now have, which is kind of what he calls humanism, which is the belief in the sanctity of human life, not because God said human life is sacred, but because human life is sacred in itself. That is what society by and large believes in today. That's not to say that religion no longer has a place in society, but it's to say that religion's place in society is no longer so central, whereas the overwhelming thing that unites even people who are religious and atheists is the belief in the sanctity of human life. Harari then argues that we are kind of at the end of humanism, and what we are now approaching is a fork in the road where there might be two possibilities. He talks about techno-humanism, which is really relying on technology to achieve or supercharge the goals of humanism, or dataism, which is where we worship information and we worship algorithms, and we trust that algorithms are always right in solving problems and achieving the goals. And against this backdrop of dataism, there's a real question for mankind as to what remains of the meaning of life. I don't always agree with everything that Harari says, but I think at a at a macro stage of the main risks and the trends that are coming for mankind, I think he brings a lot to the table that's very thought-provoking, but he's also asking the really big questions that the average kind of programmer sitting in Silicon Valley probably isn't asking itself, which is, what do we actually do about life itself when algorithms make all of the decisions for us? It's not often that I read a book ostensibly about human history and end up feeling unsettled about the meaning of life. And I think because of that, I think this is a really, really successful book. It made me think. It made me think about regulation. It made me think about the development of AI and what we must do to keep AI if not under control, then at least within our predictive abilities. Because I think the main problem going forward with artificial intelligence and a world run on algorithms is that humankind does not understand intelligence divorced from consciousness. We are conscious beings first, and then we have intelligence that sits on top of our consciousness, figuratively speaking. And we can't predict what pure intelligence will decide or how pure intelligence will act in the absence of consciousness. And that being the case, there's a real debate, I think, to be had about how we actually keep AI under control and how we actually make sure that we can predict how certain algorithms that we create will act. And I think that's really, really difficult. And it's not a debate that the tech world is having right now. So I think there needs to be a little bit of cross-pollination between tech and history and the humanities to make sure that whatever we are developing, mankind actually has some level of control and prediction over. And this book really, really made me think about all of these issues. So it's really thought-provoking. I had a fabulous month. I started off last month with 69 books unread. I read 3 books and all of them were off my unread shelf, which means that as at the 1st of December, I have 66 unread books on my unread shelf. So we are slowly getting there. We will definitely dip under 65 by the end of December, which I'm really, really pleased about. And we're also approaching my 1 year on BookTube, so I'll probably do some videos about that as well. So happy December. For those of you who celebrate Christmas, happy Christmas, and I will see you very soon.